On the morning of October 11th, 1854, Charleston woke beneath a haze of warm autumn air, the kind that clung to the cobblestones and softened the edges of the pastel houses lining Chalmers Street. By mid-morning, the usual murmur of carriage wheels and vendors' calls had taken on an oddly taut quality, as though the city itself sensed that something was nearing its surface, something unwelcome, something long concealed. Inside Ryan's private auction house, a place shielded from the noise and scrutiny of the public market, nearly 60 men had gathered with the expectation of a routine sale. These were planters, merchants, bankers, and factors, men accustomed to witnessing human lives reduced to numbers on ledgers. Yet even before the proceedings began, a subtle tension moved among them, a faint electric unease that none could name. Later, many would insist they felt the shift the moment they crossed the threshold, as though the air inside the building held its breath, quietly arranging itself for an event that would break the rhythm of everything Charleston believed immutable. Marcus Ryan, proprietor of this discreet establishment, presided over such events with measured precision. For 23 years he had facilitated transactions for men who valued privacy above all else, earning a reputation rare in his line of work: reliability. His records were immaculate, his discretion impeccable, and his ability to calm even the most contentious bidders almost legendary. But that morning, as he completed the sale of several household servants from a deceased estate, something unusual unsettled his usual composure. His clerks noted the faint stiffness in his shoulders, the way he kept glancing toward a closed door at the rear of the platform. The usual talking, coughing, and paper shuffling among the buyers faded as the final bill of sale was signed. Then, at precisely 10:30, the rear door opened, and a hush fell so suddenly that even the birds outside seemed to pause. 2 men entered first, travel-worn, armed, silent. Between them walked a woman whose presence shifted the room's gravity in a way no enslaved person ever had. She was taller than most women of that era, her posture straight and deliberate, as though she had spent her entire life refusing to bend even when forced to bow. Her dress, dark blue cotton with careful stitching, did not belong to someone who labored in fields, nor did her unscarred skin. Her hair was braided in meticulous patterns that suggested hours of quiet preparation. Yet, what unsettled the assembled men was not her height, her dress, or her bearing. It was her gaze. She looked at each of them with an uncompromising steadiness, as if she were committing every detail of their faces to memory. More than one man shifted under that stare, feeling absurdly as though he were the one being appraised. Her wrists were bound not with iron but with silk rope, a detail that drew whispers. Silk suggested value. Silk suggested a different kind of danger, and the 2 escorts at her sides, their weapons displayed openly, suggested that whatever threat she posed was not physical but something far more difficult to contain. Ryan descended from his platform, confusion and irritation mixing across his features. The escorts handed him a packet of documents. The moment his eyes moved across the lines, the color drained from his face. Witnesses later disagreed on whether his hands shook or simply tightened, but all agreed that the man who prided himself on composure looked suddenly older. He read the papers twice, lips moving silently, then lifted his gaze toward the woman as though seeing her for the first time. If she noticed his alarm, she gave no sign. When Ryan finally climbed back onto the platform, the room leaned forward, sensing the weight of whatever information had just been placed in his hands. His voice, normally confident, faltered as he announced the lot. The woman had no recorded name, no documented work history, no past owner listed. She was designated only as Lot 47. And then Ryan stated the opening bid, $10,000. The reaction was instantaneous. Disbelief, outrage, incredulous laughter. $10,000 was more than most plantations saw in profit in a year. But Ryan did not retract the number. Instead, he read aloud the final lines from the seller's affidavit, his voice shrinking as he spoke. The woman, he said, possessed knowledge, specific, verified knowledge, of events involving some of Charleston's most influential men between 1846 and 1853. Knowledge demonstrated before unnamed witnesses. Knowledge impossible to extract through force. Knowledge tied to incidents long whispered about but never confirmed. A summer gathering at Magnolia Plantation, the mysterious warehouse fire of 1851, a maritime disaster whose official explanation had never satisfied the more discerning merchants, and other matters not yet spoken aloud. As he read, panic flickered across the room. Some men stood abruptly and left. Others sat rigid, calculating how much their fortunes could withstand. No one dismissed the claim as absurd. They understood instantly the meaning. This woman knew things, dangerous things, and someone had orchestrated her arrival here with precise intent. The bidding that followed was frenzied, reckless, driven not by desire for labor, but by fear of exposure. Prices leapt in staggering increments, climbing past 20,000, then 30. At 40,000, only a handful remained. And at $42,000, the highest recorded price for a single enslaved person in Charleston's history, the bidding ended. The buyer, a quiet man with northern mannerisms and an unreadable face, accepted the sale without triumph, without arrogance, as though he had simply purchased a tool required for work only he understood. When he unbound the woman's wrists and offered his arm, the room froze. She accepted with the ease of someone stepping into a role she had chosen long before this moment. Charleston buzzed long after the auction ended, its streets carrying whispers faster than the tide that washed against the battery. By evening, rumor had become fever. Men who had not attended the auction sought those who had, pressing for details with forced nonchalance. But no one truly wanted details. They wanted reassurance, some sign that the woman's ominous declaration held no threat to them. They received none. The tale spread. A woman who spoke like an educated northerner, who looked each man in the eye without hesitation, who claimed, without saying a word, to hold knowledge capable of shattering fortunes. And the man who bought her, that quiet stranger, left the city before dusk, with a swiftness that suggested urgency rather than triumph. When the money, the spectacular sum of $42,000, was verified and exchanged, the crowd dispersed without lingering, each man returning home in a state of subdued panic. Behind shuttered windows that night, Charleston's elite found themselves revisiting memories they had buried long ago, searching for any overlooked moment when an enslaved servant might have stood too close, listened too carefully, or understood too much. The sale marked the beginning of movements that appeared unrelated on the surface, but were, in truth, currents pulled by the same unseen tide. The very next morning, 3 prominent families cancelled social gatherings without explanation. 2 merchants withdrew large sums from their banks, one quietly sending his eldest son north for education, though he had never before considered such an option. At the same time, a lawyer in the city's legal district was seen burning papers in his courtyard until the ashes formed small dark drifts along the cobblestones. And Marcus Ryan, the auctioneer whose reputation had long been a pillar of Charleston commerce, shuttered his establishment within 48 hours. He claimed illness, yet he looked neither fevered nor frail. Instead, he appeared burdened by a weight he could not share, a man who had glimpsed something behind a curtain that should never have been drawn back. He sold the building quickly and cheaply, packed his belongings, and boarded a steamship heading west, leaving behind decades of meticulously kept records. Those records, he insisted, were destroyed for the safety of all involved, a phrase that only deepened the unease curling through Charleston's streets like mist. 6 weeks later, a new figure stepped quietly into the story. Harrison Calhoun, an attorney known for his measured temperament and impeccable discretion. He was not hired publicly. No official announcement marked his involvement. Instead, a sealed envelope appeared at his office bearing no signature, only an instruction: investigate Lot 47. Inside was a generous retainer, far more money than Calhoun typically received for property disputes, and a list of questions regarding the woman's origins, the legitimacy of the documents Ryan read aloud, and the identity of the man who had purchased her. The anonymity of the clients concerned Calhoun. The magnitude of their fear intrigued him. He began with the supposed affidavit notarized by a Charleston magistrate. But when he sought the original, he found that no such document had ever been filed. Each of the 3 magistrates authorized to notarize such papers denied involvement with vehemence that bordered on anxiety. The seals described by witnesses did not appear in any ledger. This should have been impossible. Legal records in Charleston were maintained with near religious devotion. Yet here, something had erased itself, deliberately and completely. Calhoun's next step, tracing the seller, proved equally fruitless. Ryan's records, which should have preserved the chain of ownership, no longer existed. His clerks remembered only fragments. Two men had delivered the woman to Ryan's private office days before the auction. They stayed briefly, produced papers Ryan examined in solitude, and departed without names or explanations. One clerk recalled that Ryan had poured himself a drink immediately afterward, something he rarely did during working hours. Another remembered him muttering, "This isn't what it seems." Unable to question the seller directly, Calhoun sought the men who transported the woman. He found one of them, a courier named Thomas Burke, working near the docks. Burke, wary and reluctant, eventually agreed to speak, though with caution sharpened by experience. The job, he said, had been unlike any other. He and his partner were hired through intermediaries to retrieve a package from an abandoned plantation deep in the low country. Only when they arrived did they learn the package was a woman who introduced herself calmly and without fear as merchandise of unusual value. She gave them a letter addressed to Ryan, carried a single leather bag, and walked as though she had been waiting for them. Burke's account unsettled Calhoun more than the contradictions in the legal records. He described how the woman spoke sparingly during the 3-day journey, yet observed everything: the route, the camp arrangements, even the sound of animals in the distance, with a vigilance that felt unnatural. On their final night, she finally addressed Burke directly. He repeated her words carefully, almost reverently, as though they still sat heavy on his mind. "You wonder who I am, what I know. Understand only this: knowledge becomes valuable when those who fear it cannot escape its reach." Burke admitted he could not sleep after hearing that. He insisted she meant him no harm, but believed deeply that her words were not a threat. They were simple truth. He also revealed that she carried a book, which she left in the abandoned house with instructions for the caretaker to burn it. Calhoun arranged to meet the caretaker, a soft-spoken elderly man who confessed that, instead of burning the book, curiosity had compelled him to hide it. And so, in the rotting library of a forgotten plantation, beneath a floorboard worn smooth by time, Calhoun found it. The book Calhoun discovered was unlike anything he had ever encountered. It was hand-stitched, its leather cover worn but carefully maintained, as though it had traveled long distances tucked close to the body of someone who understood its worth. When he opened it, expecting bare pages or the rough handwriting of an enslaved servant, he found neat columns of symbols rendered with meticulous precision. The marks resembled no alphabet he recognized. Some curved like fragments of Hebrew script. Others appeared as if borrowed from mathematical notation, and still others formed geometric patterns that repeated with purposeful variation. Interspersed among these symbols were occasional English words, names of plantations, shipping firms, and individuals prominent in Charleston's commerce. Dates appeared frequently, accompanied by numerical sequences that defied immediate interpretation. The caretaker, watching nervously, explained that the woman had spent hours reading and writing inside the abandoned house, sometimes pausing mid-sentence as if listening to something only she could hear. She told him the book was dangerous, not because of anything he might see, but because of what others would do if they knew he kept it. Calhoun felt the truth of that warning as he turned each page. He examined the volume for hours, fascinated and unsettled, until he reached the final page, one of the few sections written entirely in English. It stated plainly that the book contained testimony of events witnessed over 7 years, and that the key to interpreting its cipher had been entrusted to a single buyer. "Those who seek answers without the key," the sentence continued, "will find only shadows." The simplicity of the message chilled him. The woman had anticipated pursuit. She had expected that powerful men would attempt to decipher her record after the auction, and she had designed the book to be useless to them. Calhoun realized then that the sale had not been a desperate attempt to escape bondage. It had been the final step in a long, deliberate plan. Someone who understood the architecture of Charleston's corruption had constructed a trap, lured its participants toward it, and ensured that only one person, her chosen purchaser, would receive the full truth. The book itself felt alive in his hands, not merely a document, but a repository of secrets straining against the coded walls that confined them. When Calhoun reported his findings to the anonymous clients who had hired him, their reaction revealed more than their words. They did not feign shock or disbelief. Instead, they expressed urgency. The book was to be surrendered immediately. Further investigation was unnecessary, and his services were no longer required. They compensated him generously, but the money carried a bitter weight. Calhoun sensed that the individuals behind the investigation were not a unified group, but a coalition of frightened men whose interests overlapped only through shared vulnerability. They wanted the book, not to uncover the truth, but to bury it. Yet as they spoke, Calhoun noticed something else. Fear had eroded their composure. Wealth, connections, and influence had shielded them for decades, but now a single woman had disrupted the delicate lattice of secrecy upon which their reputations depended. And she had done so without raising her voice, without lifting a weapon, without breaking a single law. Power, Calhoun realized, was more fragile than the men who wielded it dared admit. A single witness had shattered the illusion of control they believed absolute. In the months that followed, Charleston's surface life continued with its usual grace. The Battery promenades, the clatter of carriages along Broad Street, the church bells echoing at dusk. But beneath that veneer, anxiety fermented. Men who had once strutted through the commercial district with unshakable confidence now walked with forced calm. Conversations grew guarded. Business partners exchanged glances heavy with suspicion. Every whispered rumor about unfolding scandals, fraud in a shipping company, unaccounted funds in a bank, a plantation owner fleeing to Savannah, carried the same question beneath it. Was this the woman's doing? And if so, how much more did she plan to reveal? Meanwhile, the northern man who had purchased her vanished from Charleston's view entirely. No letters, no inquiries, no returned funds. It was as though he and the woman had stepped beyond the reach of the city's influence, carrying with them the power to dismantle lives by the simple act of remembering. Calhoun, though no longer involved, could not escape the feeling that he had witnessed the beginning of something, a slow unspooling of consequences set in motion long before the auction. Then came the first public fracture. A prominent shipping firm collapsed under allegations of long-buried fraud. Investigators uncovered discrepancies so specific that someone must have provided exact figures, dates, and names. Days later, federal officers arrived to arrest two customs officials in connection with a bribery scheme thought extinguished years earlier. Each revelation landed with the precise impact of a hammer blow, deliberate, timed, and aimed at the foundations of Charleston's commercial elite. Rumors spread that anonymous packages containing ledgers, correspondence, and detailed reports had been delivered to authorities. The accuracy of these materials stunned investigators. They read as though written by someone who had sat silently in rooms where men discussed crimes they believed unobserved. Someone who had listened, remembered, and preserved everything. For the first time, powerful families realized these exposures were not random misfortunes. They were consequences. The woman whose knowledge they had once dismissed as impossible was somewhere in the world, turning their forgotten sins into instruments of reckoning. And the coded book Calhoun had surrendered was only the ghost of what she truly possessed. As 1855 unfolded, Charleston's polished veneer continued to crack. New scandals surfaced with unsettling regularity, each one revealing a layer of corruption previously dismissed as rumor or exaggeration. What unnerved the city most was not the crimes themselves. Charleston's elite had tolerated dubious dealings for generations, but the precision with which these wrongdoings were exposed. Evidence arrived anonymously, always complete, always irrefutable, as if someone possessed an archive of misdeeds recorded in real time. By spring, an unspoken belief took root among the city's wealthiest families. The woman sold at Ryan's auction had not acted alone. She must have belonged to something larger, an unseen network threaded quietly through Charleston's households and businesses. Servants who once blended into the background now drew wary glances. Conversations ceased when a maid entered the room. Men who once dismissed enslaved people as incapable of complex thought now confronted the possibility that those they had ignored were, in fact, their most attentive witnesses. The realization struck with the force of an unexpected storm. The foundation of power had always been porous. Months later, far from Charleston, evidence supporting that suspicion surfaced. In Philadelphia, a small academy for formerly enslaved people opened its doors, funded by anonymous benefactors. The donation was substantial enough to provide books, lodging, and instructors for years to come. Around the same time, abolitionist lawyers in Boston received an inexplicably large endowment, allowing them to expand their legal defenses for fugitives. And in New York, a farming settlement for freed families purchased fertile land with funds that appeared as quietly as a shadow passing across a window. None of these entities knew the source of their benefactor, but their accounting books recorded money transfers that traced back to northern banks that once handled the letter of credit presented at Ryan's auction. The pattern was unmistakable. The extraordinary sum paid for the woman had not vanished. It had been transformed into seeds of liberation, scattered across the North with purposeful intention. Those who connected the dots understood that her influence extended far beyond Charleston's crumbling secrets. She was reshaping futures, not merely dismantling pasts. Meanwhile, the revelations targeting Charleston continued with unnerving accuracy. In early 1856, investigators uncovered a banking scheme involving falsified cotton valuations, records so detailed they could only have been preserved by someone with access to private meetings. Shortly afterward, customs officials were indicted based on account books that had supposedly burned in a fire years earlier. The city's elite could no longer maintain the illusion that these exposures were unfortunate coincidences. They began speaking privately and with dread of a listener who had haunted their halls for years, silently observing, memorizing every careless admission. That fear intensified when an abolitionist newspaper published a harrowing account of an incident at Magnolia Plantation, an event long suppressed through intimidation and bribes. The article described a young enslaved girl who had overheard damning conversations at a secret meeting and had been taken away under the guise of punishment, never to be seen again. The piece named individuals involved with unsettling certainty. Men who had long considered themselves untouchable now found their reputations collapsing under the weight of truths they thought buried. The Magnolia revelation spread through Charleston like a plague of memory. Those who had attended the meeting recognized details only an eyewitness could have known. The precise placement of furniture in the parlor, the pattern of rainfall on the roof that evening, the sequence of debates that unfolded as whiskey blurred judgment. The description of the girl, her youth, her quiet demeanor, her sudden disappearance, reopened wounds many had tried to forget. But what devastated them most was the confirmation that she had not been alone that night. Another servant had been present in the shadows, unnoticed. Another young woman had listened, absorbed every word, and survived to remember. The realization struck like a collective confession. They had underestimated the intelligence of those they enslaved, dismissed their presence as insignificant, and spoken freely in rooms where silence did not equal ignorance. For the first time, Charleston's ruling class understood that their downfall was not delivered by outsiders. It was authored by those they believed incapable of writing anything at all. By the end of 1856, Charleston was a city living under a peculiar kind of siege, not from armies or political enemies, but from its own past returning with meticulous vengeance. Men avoided social clubs they once frequented. Business ventures stalled as partners questioned one another's integrity. Auctions saw fewer buyers. Plantation owners postponed winter trips, afraid to leave their estates vulnerable to sudden scandal. And whispered through all these shifts was a single haunting question. How had one woman gathered so much? Theories proliferated. Some believed she had been unusually intelligent. Others claimed she possessed supernatural senses. Yet the truth, slowly pieced together by researchers decades later, was both simpler and more devastating. She had not worked alone. For years, enslaved domestic workers, those who poured wine, scrubbed floors, mended clothing and tended fires, had quietly formed a network of observation, sharing information to protect one another from dangerous owners and cruel overseers. Many could not read or write, but they passed details orally with stunning accuracy, and in the center of that web sat the woman from the auction, the one who could document what others preserved in memory. She had not created the network. She had refined it. And Charleston, built on the assumption that invisible people cannot see, had never stood a chance. In the decades that followed, the woman once known only as Lot 47 faded from Charleston's public memory, but grew in influence in ways no one could have predicted. After securing her freedom, she settled in the North under a name she chose for herself, and her life took on a quiet, disciplined clarity. She established a school for formerly enslaved people, teaching reading, writing, and arithmetic with the same precision she once applied to observing Charleston's elite. Those who met her later in life described her as calm, reserved, and remarkably self-possessed, as though she carried an inner ledger that balanced every injustice she had seen. She spoke little of her past, offering no hint of the years she spent gathering secrets at the edges of drawing rooms and counting houses. But the effects of her earlier work rippled outward long after she closed the ciphered book and stepped away from the world that had once claimed to own her. The scandal she exposed continued to reshape Charleston for years, toppling families, dismantling fortunes, and forcing a reckoning with the hidden architecture of power that had supported the city's wealth. Years later, long after the Civil War had erased the legal structure of slavery, scholars began piecing together the story of her remarkable life. Fragments surfaced in court records, abandoned ledgers, and oral histories passed down through generations. A soldier's memoir recounted a conversation overheard at a dinner party in which a planter admitted the woman had been more intelligent than any of them wished to confront. Decades later, interviews with elderly freedpeople revealed recollections of a quiet house servant who remembered everything with perfect clarity. These accounts painted a portrait of someone who had recognized early that invisibility, the condition slavery imposed upon her, could be transformed into a weapon. She learned to speak only when required, to listen when unnoticed, and to store every detail with methodical patience. Her ciphered book, once thought indecipherable, eventually resurfaced in academic circles through the descendants of the man who purchased her. Scholars who examined the pages discovered that her system blended multiple linguistic traditions, woven together with mathematical logic. It was not simply a code, it was a statement of authorship, proof that even under bondage her mind had remained beyond reach. When portions of her hidden memoir were finally deciphered, they revealed thoughts she had never intended for public eyes. She wrote of carrying knowledge like a burden that thickened with each passing year, of the psychological weight of observing crimes she could not yet expose. She feared her death would come before her opportunity, leaving the truth locked inside her memory without witness or consequence. She also reflected on the paradox of her position, how enslavers believed her incapable of comprehension, even as she mapped the inner workings of their world with an accuracy that surpassed their own. She understood their financial systems, their political alliances, their rivalries, and the dark spaces where greed overshadowed law. And in her writings, she articulated a philosophy of resistance rooted not in rebellion but in evidence, in the belief that a structure built on hidden crimes could be unraveled by placing those crimes in the open. Her plan required patience measured not in days or months but in years, a discipline so rare that even historians found themselves astonished by the scale of her foresight. By the early 20th century, historians began recognizing the woman's work as a landmark example of intellectual resistance within an institution designed to suppress intellect. Her life challenged long-held assumptions about the limits placed on enslaved people's agency. Scholars noted that her strategy did not rely on physical escape, armed rebellion, or external intervention. Instead, she used the very mechanisms of the society that oppressed her. She turned plantation ledgers into evidence, overheard conversations into testimonies, and the arrogance of the powerful into pathways toward their undoing. Her contributions extended beyond revenge. The funds from her sale supported abolitionist legal battles, educational initiatives, and communities striving to build independent lives. Long after her death, her ciphered book influenced emerging research into coded writing traditions among enslaved people, revealing a hidden intellectual landscape historians had overlooked. What began as one woman's private record became a catalyst for rethinking how memory, literacy, and resistance intersected in the antebellum South. Her life became an exemplar of how truth, when preserved with precision, can outlive even the systems designed to silence it. By the time her story reached wider audiences, nearly a century after her death, the city that once tried to erase her influence had transformed. Charleston's descendants could no longer deny the consequences of the secrets she unearthed, nor the brilliance with which she dismantled a social order that believed itself invulnerable. Her legacy endured not through monuments or public proclamations, but through the quiet persistence of memory. Her writings preserved in archives, her story echoed in academic research, and her philosophy reflected in movements that valued truth as a form of liberation. She demonstrated that power built on silence is inherently unstable, and that a single witness, armed only with patience and intellect, can alter the course of history. Her life remains a testament to the resilience of the oppressed and the fragile foundations of those who mistake dominance for security. In the end, the greatest secret she revealed was not the crimes of Charleston's elite, but the simple fact that nothing remains hidden forever. Knowledge waits, memory endures, and sooner or later, the truth finds its moment to step into the light.